Okay, so this is part 2 of a series that I'm doing that is focused on some very quick kind of kickstart content for how to get started on the Quad Cortex. And in the first session, we went through kind of how to build out a preset and getting to know the Cortex Control app and all the features of it. And in this one, what I want to do is go through all the different types of blocks. And I'll say we're not going to go through and try every kind of block. I've got deep dive videos on delays and reverbs and modulations and compressors and all of that. And I'll put links to those in the description. What I wanted to do today was go through each of the type, talk about what's in that type of block, and talk about, one, some of the key aspects I think you need to know to get started, and two, maybe some of my favorites, either amps or effects that are in that block, and the ones I kind of gravitate towards when I'm building out presets. In the first video, we built out this stereo dual amp line up here that's running 2 Mesa Boogie Lone Stars. And I've just added this second line where I'm adding in some captures so that we can play around with those as well and get to know some of the key aspects of those. If you look, what I've done here is these two flows are running completely in parallel. They both have their own input, the same input, input 1, and they're both running the multi-out. What I do is when I want to use one, I just go and mute the other one. So I've muted the capture one for right now. And when we get to talking about captures, we'll unmute this and mute the one with the Lone Star amps. So let's go ahead and get into the amps. So if we go here, we see our list of amps, and you can have guitar amps and bass amps. So I'm a guitarist. We're going to focus on the guitar amps for now. And you can see there's quite a few of them to choose from. And the naming convention is pretty straightforward. Brit is Marshall, CA for California, that's Mesa Boogie. You got D-Cell, these are the EVH ones. Freeman is Friedman. Matchmore is Matchless. PV is PV. Roland, Soldano, so Solo is Soldano. UK is Vox. US is Fender. And Victor is Victory, and Watt is High Watt. So it's pretty straightforward how to figure out what the models are. And if you have any questions, in the Quad Cortex manual, it'll tell you the exact amp that each model is using. So the first thing I want to do is, just for instance, I'm going to click up here on this block in my main flow. And when I do so, if I go to amps, you'll see almost all of them are grayed out. The only one that's not is this Roland Jazz. The reason for that is different amp models have different CPU requirements. And I'm already running a good number of blocks in my upper flow here. And I don't have enough CPU to add any of the other blocks. If I go down here where it says CPU and I click on that, it'll show you, it's kind of like a phone battery charger status. It'll show you how much CPU each block is using. And you can see the Mesa Boogie Lone Stars are actually quite expensive, so to speak, in terms of Quad Cortex CPU usage. So if we were to go look at the amps, I would say the Lone Stars are pretty heavy. These Mesa Boogie, these are the John Patrici amps. These are also very heavy in terms of CPU usage. And the Victory Kraken is also quite heavy. So keep that in mind. Different amps have different CPU requirements. And like we saw here, when I clicked on here and went to amp, the only one I had enough CPU to add was the Roland Jazz, which is a pretty low CPU intensive model. All the other ones are too heavy. So keep that in mind. Whenever you're trying to add something to your Quad Cortex line, if you go into the menu and things are grayed out, that means you're out of CPU. So the other thing I want to talk about applies to when you're running amps in parallel. So I'm going to go here. Right now I'm running 2 Mesa Boogie Lone Stars. I'm going to switch this one. We're just going to use a Marshall Plexi Bright. I'm going to go ahead and accept that. I'm going to bring the gain down a little bit. And we're going to push the output level to correspond to that. So now my stereo path is running a Mesa Boogie on the left and this Marshall on the right. And it sounds fine. The reason I picked this Marshall, one, I like the combination of the Lone Star with the Marshall Plexi. I think it's a good sound. But one of the things you need to watch out for is if I pan these both down the center, I don't know if you can quite tell, we're getting a phase issue. And the way you fix that is the mixer actually has a phase reverse. And when I've turned that on, you can hear the volume goes up, it fills out, it sounds more natural. So keep that in mind. If you run stereo paths and you're combining things, and this could be coming from captures, it could be coming from amp models, it could be coming from overdrive pedals, sometimes certain combinations get out of phase with each other. And so if you hear it sounding funny like that, and it's more quiet than you expect, and maybe it sounds a little hollow, try switching the phase, and that may fix it. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Let's go ahead and restore this back to where we were with our Amazing Bleeding Lone Stars. All right. So in terms of the amps, you know, my favorites, I do like the Plexies quite a bit. The Lone Star is probably far and away my favorite amp model on the Quad Cortex. The Johns are very good, especially the Channel 1 is a great kind of pure clean. I like the PVs quite a bit, even more than the EVHs. The Soldano is good. The Vox ones are okay. I'm not a huge kind of Vox fan in general, but these models aren't great to me. And some of the Fenders are pretty good. But if you're looking for Fenders, I would encourage you to look for captures. I think there's better sounding captures out there. And the Victory Kraken model is also very good. I did a whole preset and video on that. So you should go check that out, but that's a great amp. The one thing I would point out is if we bring up a Victory Kraken, it has this ability to switch tube types. And the only thing to watch out for is if you switch these tube types via a scene, switching this, you get an interruption in your guitar tone. So if you want to have a preset that's using the Kraken and you want to switch tube types between the scenes, the way to do it is actually have two blocks of the same amp model and have one set to EL34 and one to 6L6, and then just switch power on, power off on the scene. If you switch the tube type in a scene, you'll get an interruption. So they've even added that here. So that's just a quick run through of the amps and some of the things I think are important to understand. So let's talk about the captures. So I'm going to mute this and we're going to unmute this one. And we'll start with this capture. So the first thing I'll say is obviously there's tons of captures available on the Cortex Cloud. There's also some that were included with the Quad Cortex. I'm not a huge fan of most of the captures that come with the Quad Cortex kind of preloaded. None of them really stand out to me. I think the ones you'll find on Cortex Cloud will be higher quality. There are tons of them on the Cortex Cloud, and they vary in quality and volume levels, and it's really just kind of hit and miss finding the ones that you think are good. Obviously, the bigger makers like the Worship Tutorial or Amalgam, those are all typically pretty high quality. They have some free sample ones. I've got actually one in this preset that we're going to check out. But overall, it's kind of hit and miss, and it's best to kind of look for what are the more popular ones and see if you can find ones that work for you. The other thing to remember is that there's different kinds of amp captures, and we go to the filter here. We can see the type of capture, amp plus cab, combo amp, which is really a different kind of amp plus cab. So the difference there is amp does not have a cabinet or an IR included in the capture. So if you use an amp capture, you have to pair it with a cab block or an IR. Amp and cab and combo amps, you do not pair with an IR. That'd be like running through a cab and through another cab. There are cab captures. I've never used one of those. And then there's pedal captures. And then if you find a fault, that usually means it was an older capture that wasn't categorized because they added categories kind of late in the release cycle. And then obviously there's types of instruments as well. So let's compare this. So this capture here is a Cox Studio Tone Crunch. This one is a combo amp, and you can tell by the icon. And if we play it, It's a pretty quiet capture. You've got to push the volume a good amount. It sounds pretty good, but it's pretty quiet. And the one thing I want to make sure that you understand is you do have some controls over the captures. The EQ is pretty basic and is a post EQ, and it only goes 6 dB in either direction. So you don't have tons of control around the EQ, but it can help you tweak EQ a little bit. But the gain levels go from -24 to +24. So you actually have a good amount of control of the gain. And if the capture is made well, and it's kind of made in that edge of breakup space, I find that these captures can be very, very flexible. So if we take this one, if we get at 0 dB on the gain, there's a good amount of crunch there, but not tons. If I bring it down, say to about 12, you can hear it's pretty clean. If I go the opposite, and I push it all the way up, you can hear there's a good amount of gain there. So remember that when you're using these captures, you have some amount of control on how much gain you want to have, and to a certain extent, some control around the EQ. The other thing I'll say is, in my experience, captures that include a cab, sometimes the bass can get a little heavy. And when that happens, what I do is I'll run a high pass filter. And the way I would do that is you go over here, and in the EQ setting, there's a low high cut, and you can do a high pass filter. And typically some of these captures, if they have a cab included, you need to go like to at least 80 Hertz, or maybe even as high as 120, 150 Hertz to kind of cut out some of that low end boominess. So if you grab a capture that includes a cab and you're finding the bass kind of muddy and heavy, my first thing to do is go add a high pass filter and try that out. This one isn't bad, so you don't need it. So let's go ahead and turn that one off. I'm going to turn this one on. So this is one from Amalgam, and this is a 2-Rock OD50 clean. And if I play it, maybe it needs a little more volume. You hear it doesn't sound good because this is just an amp. And you can see they even name it DI, meaning it's just a direct amp. It needs an IR. And so what I've got here is an IR block. I'm going to turn it on. And the IR blocks, there's dual IRs and single. And I'm running a dual IR in mono. So it's basically miking 2 cabs and mixing them together. And I'm bringing in my IRs. This one's from Amalgam. It's a free one. It's a Fender 2x12 with G12s in it. And then I've got another free one from Amalgam that's got EV12s in it. So once we add the IR, we can hear it sounds way better because it was a direct amp, and without an IR, it sounded pretty bad. And this is another one that, has a good amount of gain on tap if you want it to. So let's go ahead and we're going to mute that. We'll go back to this one. We're back to our Lone Star now. So cab blocks, we went through this a little bit in the other video. So cabs are either stereo or mono. And the key there is if you run a stereo signal through a stereo cab block, it'll keep the stereo. But if you notice, if I go here, if I go to a stereo, even if I'm using the same cab, watch the CPU usage. See how it went up? So using stereo cabs is going to chew up more of your CPU. In general, I don't use stereo cabs a lot. In this case, I could have used a stereo cab because I'm using the same cab actually both here. I could actually get rid of this cab, move the mixer in front of this, make this one stereo, back to my ribbon 10. And now I have one cab instead of two. And even though the stereo cab uses more CPU, one block uses less CPU than two. So, the other thing about cabs is obviously you can choose the different mics you want, and you can also move the mics around. So if I wanted to move this one over and away a little bit, I can do that. Or you can use the dials. And then on the second screen, you have the ability to do high-pass filters and low-pass filters in the cabs themselves. And so a lot of times I'll put a low-pass filter on, usually down around 6K. That sounds pretty good. You can see the cabs are ordered by kind of number of speakers and the size. So it's a 1x10, 1x12, 2x10, 2x12. Usually I use either the 2x12s, my favorite is the Mesa Recto with the V30, and I also use the 4x12s. Again, I like the Mesa with the V30. The 03 one is my favorite. The 4x12 high watt is also one of my favorites, especially for kind of, if I want a big, warm, clean tone, a lot of times I'll use this 4x12. So the next would be overdrives. Again, the naming conventions are pretty straightforward. So the Brits are Marshalls, Marshall Bluesbreaker, Marshall Governor, Chief. These are Boss pedals. Exotic is exotic. The Fuzz Face, the Freeman, Green 808 is your Tube Screamer. Myth Drive is your Klon. Nobel OD1 is your Nobel OD1. Obsessive Drive is your OCD. Rodent Drive is your Rat. So these are all your basic kind of overdrive pedals. There's a few that I'd like to see. I'd love to see a kind of a tube driver, like a BK Butler tube driver kind of thing. And it'd be nice to have maybe a Zen Drive kind of pedal. But again, there's captures of those things in the Cortex Cloud, so you can go find them. Next, you have delays. So typically I'm going to run a stereo delay. A lot of times I like to run them after the amps. Analog delay is one of my favorites. The dual delay is great if you want to do that kind of Andy Timmons 500 milliseconds and 300 milliseconds thing. There is a reverse delay. The tape delay is also pretty good, although it is pretty heavy in terms of CPU. So for instance, if I was to add that here, you can see how much more CPU the tape delay takes over this ping pong delay. Even if I make it the digital delay, you can see the CPU went down a little bit. The other thing I'll add is, and a lot of the digital effects have this, there's this dyne mode. So if you're interested in doing any kind of ducking, that's where you find this. For reverbs, I'm a big proponent of the plate reverbs. I like the plate lush. That's what we're using here. The ambience, cave hall, those are just kind of different size of rooms. Mine hall modulation are kind of more modulated. Shimmer is where you can do kind of a pitch shifted swell. Oh, and all the effects like delays and reverbs and things like that have this trails. The trails basically means if I have trails off and I play the shimmer, as soon as I turn it off, like if I switch scenes and turn it off, it would kill the effect. But if I have trails on, you can hear it keeps going even when I turn the effect off. And then there's spring reverbs. I'm not a big fan of the spring reverbs on the Quad Cortex. I typically go for the plate reverbs. Compressors, my favorite is the Jewel. That's actually what we're using here. That's the one that I'm most likely to use if I want to compress the front of the signal. The other compressors I might use if I'm doing some compression towards the back end. I've done videos on the compressors and how to use them to kind of create a little more sag in how the amps sound. And you would do that by putting a compressor after the amp. The pitch shift is pretty good. You've got a regular pitch shifter. So if I go here and I add a pitch shifter, you have a coarse setting, which is kind of your pitch. So if I go up 12, that'd be going up an octave. Let's set the mix down. That doesn't sound good. It's a little synthesizer-y to my ear, but it works. And then the fine allows you to do kind of a certain amount of chorusing. So this is great if you want to So this is great, that 80s pitch shift chorus, or Eddie Van Halen would do this in the 90s. He'd have a wet, dry, wet. I did a whole preset on that 90s Van Halen wet, dry, wet that's running multiple pitch shifters to kind of get a chorusing effect. The other pitch effect, you've got a polyoctaver, pretty straightforward. Wham doesn't do you any good unless you have an expression pedal. And then there's a mini voicer, which I don't have enough CPU to use. I'm going to add it down here so we can just look at it. The difference with the mini voicer and the pitch shifter is the mini voicer allows you to set your key, and whether you're in major or minor. And what that allows you to do is, rather than just shifting a certain number of half steps, it's going to shift based on the scale. So if you want to have kind of a dual guitar in harmony kind of thing, this might be a better way to do it because it's going to keep you in key. But you need to make sure you set the root key right. And in this case, we're at A minor. So modulation, again, there's a lot here. You've got a bunch of Boss stuff. You've got a great chorus engine and a flanger engine. You've got the MX stuff. You've got a rotary, a tremolo, vibrato. I did videos on all of these. There's too much to go into here in this video. But generally, I think these work pretty well. So if we keep going, the morph, the only thing here is a freeze. I don't really use that very often. It just allows you to sustain a note or a chord. Filters, so these are your envelope filter kind of things. It's kind of the closest to an auto wah you'll find on the Quad Cortex. And so it can be kind of cool to play with. EQ, we've already talked about the low high cuts. You know, the Graphic 9 EQ is nice. It's pretty flexible. It also has a high pass filter and a low pass filter built in. And then you have parametric EQs. And so these are really flexible because you can set the frequency to whatever you want. So you can take each block. In this case, we've got 4 turned on. These are turned off, but you can add them in. You can move the frequency around. You can adjust the gain. You can adjust the Q curve. There's a lot of flexibility here, and you can adjust the type. So if we made it a low pass, it would do that. If we made it a high pass, it would do that. I don't know why you would ever do it that way, but anyway. So there's a lot of flexibility there. So the EQs are pretty powerful and work really well. Wah, you've got 5 different kinds of wahs. Obviously, you need an expression pedal to really use these. Without one, they're pretty useless. Effects loop. So you've got 2 mono effects loops, or you can combine them to make them 1 stereo effect loop. You can either run the effects loop as kind of 1 block, and so send it out. It sends and returns in 1 block, or you can have separate send and return blocks. So theoretically, you could have a couple other blocks in your chain, and then get a return. So for example, maybe you want to send out to a delay, but you want to have like a chorus effect that doesn't get delayed. You want the delayed signal to be somewhat dry or something, and you can bring that back in. You have a looper. This does all of the standard looper things. You can record and overdub then and just keep going. It's pretty powerful. The one thing I'll say is you can't really use the looper when you're purely in scene mode because you can't get access to it via the foot switches. So if you're running in scene mode a lot like I do and you want to use a looper, what you need to do is run in hybrid mode. So for example, when I created my Eric Johnson preset, I wanted to use a looper because a lot of times he does that. He'll hit it like a G chord and play on top of it. And so what I ended up doing was having the top row be scenes. And then last but not least is the utility blocks. And so you've got an adaptive gate and a simple gate and a utility gate. So you've got a lot of noise gates. I don't use these a lot anymore. As soon as they added in the ability to have noise reduction in the input block, I stopped using the noise gates. So you have a volume block and you have a gain block. And I want to talk about the difference between those two. So a volume block, the level only goes to 100%. So this is what you would use if you wanted to attach an expression pedal kind of as a volume pedal. That's what this block is for. And so you would assign this to an expression pedal. I don't have one right now to demo it. And you would assign it to this level. And then via the expression pedal, you could go from 0 to 100. The utility gate has a lot more power to it. First off, the level's based on dB, so you can adjust it to off all the way up to 12 dB boost. And you can control panning, so fully left, fully right, or center. And you can affect phase, so you can invert the phase. I don't use these gain blocks a lot. Typically, if I am, it's because I'm running some kind of sophisticated kind of wet, dry, wet path kind of preset, and I want some very granular control of where I'm sending things and what the levels are. But there is a lot of power here. So that's a quick run through of all the block types on the Quad Cortex. Again, there's too much here to get into in detail in any one video. That's why I've got a whole series of videos. Even the modulation, I think I had to break that into 2 or 3 different videos to try to get through all of them. So if you want to get in detail of any of those, like the delays or the reverbs or the modulations or the pitch shifters, I've got videos specifically on those. I'll put those links in the description. But I wanted to do that real fast pass through all the aspects of it, just so you could understand what's in each category, what you could do with them, and maybe some of the specific considerations you might want to keep in mind as you're using them. I hope you found this helpful, and thanks for watching.